International climate talks have entered a 13th day as negotiators are bickering over action plans. All of this is a run-up to a key summit in Paris next year. CCTV's Dan Collyns has been covering all of the meetings for us for the last couple of weeks, and he's live from Lima now with the very latest. Dan, good evening.
Good evening, Susan. Yes, as we understand it, the presidency of the Conference of the Parties who are hosting this conference have been speaking to individual negotiating blocs about their concerns and with the text as it stands, and are putting together a new draft text which will shortly be presented to the plenary session. That's all the nations here. What are they trying to get? This is a text which will have the elements of a climate change deal, which will, in theory, be taken to Paris next year, where it will form part of a global and binding climate change deal, which should replace the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. Clearly, this is of huge importance for the world. It's the last chance to try and get a unified voice to combat climate change. 195 countries here, and this draft text, well, is still hanging in the balance.
Climate talks rarely finish on time, and these are no exception. Cracks have emerged along familiar fault lines. Who should bear the burden of cutting greenhouse gas emissions? But as talks continued, delegates of the most climate-vulnerable countries were hopeful for a deal.
We have survival stakes here, so we expect the best we can. Okay. It'll have to be something substantial.
Could this be a weak text that doesn't satisfy your needs?
All texts will satisfy this movement forward. We will figure out how to fix it if it needs fixing, but we need to have some agreement that we can carry forward to Paris.
Global negotiators are trying to prepare the elements for a new climate deal to be signed next year in Paris. But developing nations say the text doesn't include financial aid to help them cope with climate change, especially small islands.
As you've always said at small island developing states, there are things that you cannot adapt to. If you've lost your coral reefs, if you've lost coastlines, you can't adapt to that. So and loss and damage is important for us.
But richer nations like the US said a deal was crucial. The details could be ironed out next year.
Failing to produce the decision before us will be seen as a major breakdown and will deal a serious blow to the confidence of parties and others as we approach Paris.
Most delegates say the text is far from perfect, and no single country appears completely satisfied with the negotiations so far. But time is running out to find a compromise. Some observers say a bad deal is worse than no deal.
What we don't want to see here is something that locks us in to low ambition, that locks developing countries into having to make commitments that they don't actually have the capacity to meet because there's no finance.
But after 2 weeks of brokering, few countries will want to walk away from Lima empty-handed.
Susan, as we heard there, developing nations rejecting a draft text which they see as allowing developed, richer nations to shirk their responsibilities to combat climate change and, importantly, pay for the damage caused by it, for which they believe developed nations are historically responsible. They put the emissions up in the air in the first place, which caused climate change. Developed nations, on the other hand, like the United States, say that the burden needs to be shared. They say that they're making their efforts to mitigate. That means cutting emissions. Emerging economies like India, Brazil, and China must also play their part to try and move towards clean energy and away from polluting fossil fuels. That's a point that US Secretary of State John Kerry made on Thursday, saying that this is a shared responsibility for the entire world. No one country can do it alone. This is just a draft text, but clearly, as you can see, there have been a lot of sticking points, and that's why it's still being debated at this stage.
Dan Collyns, thank you so much, reporting live from Lima, Peru.